and have for over 30 years in Palo Alto, California. And what I'm doing now, I am 79 years old, is sort of cleaning up the debris of my life. In other words, I have to figure out what to do with my books and my papers and my photographs, and this has become a high priority at this time. It never was. I could keep postponing it, but now I realize that the time has come. I've got to deal with it. And I'm also doing other things. I'm always doing other things. I always wonder where my time goes. But, and I started back, I was born in 1930. So, and this is before the time of sulfa drugs or any antibiotics. And I was a sickly child. In fact, I was in Cincinnati, Ohio. I was always in the children's hospital with pneumonia or something. And one time when I went to the hospital, the nurse handed my parents my pajamas, which they forgot from the previous trip, and they said, well, we knew you'd be back, so we just kept them here. And the reason I mention this is because I had asthma. And I noticed a lot of climbers seem to have had asthma for some reason. And in those days, there was no cure for it. What they did is they wanted you to go to a high altitude for better air. So I went off to this summer camp in Colorado. And I was not very strong. I never was very strong. But it was at this summer camp in 1944, 41 and 42, and then later after the World War II, that I got the idea of hiking in mountains, Rocky Mountain National Park. And so I picked up the mountain bug. Nothing technical, just hiking and backpacking.
I mean, who introduced you? Your parents or everybody was in this?
What? I'm sorry.
How did you got introduced? Your parents?
My parents sent me off to camp. And this is one of the activities in the camp was hiking at the younger ages. And when you got older, there was backpacking as well as hiking. And the camp itself was mainly a horse camp. I mean, they were oriented toward riding horses. But they had an excellent backpack program. We would go out from this very comfortable camp 4 to 5 days at a time, going all the way through Rocky Mountain National Park, scrambling and climbing up these mountains. So I picked up the climbing bug from this, the mountain bug, you might say. And then in 1948, after camp, I wanted to do something about technical climbing with a rope. So I talked my parents into, after camp, why don't we go see Yellowstone? Of course, the main thing I wanted to go to was the Tetons, which is right before Yellowstone. And of course, we arrived there, and I wanted to go to the class, a climbing class, with a guide, Paul Petzoldt. He was a very famous guide. He was on K2 in 1938.
Who was he?
Paul Petzoldt.
Petzoldt.
And he was on K2 in 1938 with Charlie Houston and Bob Bates. So I went to a couple of days of climbing school, and then off we went up the Grand Teton. And we climbed the Grand Teton. So at that point, I was hooked on roped climbing. And as a result, at that point, I was off at military school in New Mexico. But I ordered a rope and some pitons and a hammer and ice axe, all sent to me from the co-op, now REI, and it was mailed out of the house of the founders of REI, because at that time they were working out of their house. This is 1948. And I went back to camp for a year, and there I met a fellow junior counselor, Tom Hornbein. And Tom and I knew each other, and we went on our backpacks together. So we became very close friends. And today, this is about 1949, he's my closest friend. And so we still kid each other and have a wonderful time. But it goes all the way back to that time.
But he still calls you his junior.
That's right, because you see, our joke is that he is 3 days older than I am. So I refer to him as my revered elder. I must always be polite to my revered elder. And so he has his term for me. So we have been running this theme for years.
Were you on Everest with him?
No, but what happened was, I did not go to Everest in 1963. Tom did, and Willie Unselt. But Tom, the treasurer of the expedition was the treasurer of Hughes Aircraft. And he wanted to visit the expedition at base camp. But he wanted a companion. So Tom suggested he get me. So he did. And my law firm was so impressed that the Treasure Hughes aircraft wanted me that they say, you may go. So I got to Everest Base Camp. Unfortunately, my helicopter had engine trouble and on the way out had to land. And my friend, who I am responsible for getting to Everest Base Camp, did not make it because unfortunately he got a telegram saying, come to Tokyo. And so I got to Everest Base Camp. And I did it at the last minute. I was in Namche for about a week, staying in a Sherpa house of their Sirdar. And so suddenly a runner comes from Everest. We've already had previous messages saying, can you get up here immediately? The helicopter's coming back, on its original schedule. So I hurried up there, and a Tibetan carried my pack because we went a day and a half from Namche to Everest base. And so I arrived, and Tom and Willie knew I was coming, so they were down at base camp when I arrived. And Tom sees me coming in. I had a brand new Kelty pack. This was a state-of-the-art pack. I had just bought it. I was very pleased with it. And Tom sees me and says, Nick, it's good is that a Kelty? The next thing I know, he's saying, what are you going to do with it, Nick? I said, I'm going to carry my gear out in it, Tom. I said, why don't you take one of our inferior substitutes? So he gave me his pack, and he took my Kelty. And later, he and Willie Unseld carried it over the top of Everest on the first traverse of Everest. And later, they gave it back to me after I'd got married.
You got a historic monument there.
Well, that's even a longer story because Dick Kelty wanted that pack back for an exhibit in his store, so I let him have it. And then he was bought out by a big company, and then, about 10 years ago, I got this phone call from Dick Kelty, and he's obviously angry. And what has happened is he has looked out and seen the new people threw that pack in the trash. So he called me up and said, Nick, do you want that pack? And I said, yes. So he sent it to me. So I have it back. But, as I pointed out, Everest has become the Matterhorn of mountaineering. And by what I mean is, 50 years ago, whether you're in India or the United States, if you said you were a climber to a non-climber, they would always ask, have you climbed the Matterhorn? Never thinking for a moment, why would an American or an Indian climb the Matterhorn, except for the fact, to them, the Matterhorn was a symbol of mountains. What's happened now, when people find out you're a climber, they ask, have you climbed Everest? So I say Everest has become the Matterhorn.
But Everest did not interest you.
Well, I had other things to do, and I could have joined the Everest trip probably, but I didn't want to. I was afraid. At that time, climbing was looked upon as a sign of instability in the United States. I didn't want to jeopardize my job. I'd had some good trips, so I did not try to go on the Everest trip. But when the law firm found that I could go, they were happy to have me do it. But of course, then it was too late. But anyway, so what I'm very grateful to Tom now because people say, have you climbed Everest? And I say, no, but my pack has. My pack has made the first traverse of Mount Everest. So that just stops everybody right in their tracks.
So how did your then climbing proceeded?
Okay, what happened then was, now I had exposure to high mountains, weather, and scrambling and mountain conditions from the summer camps in Colorado. Then I transferred from military school out to Stanford. And Stanford had an Alpine Club, which climbed in Yosemite. There are not more than 100 rock climbers in the state of California, and they all belong to either the Stanford Alpine Club or the couple of Sierra Club chapters, the rock climbing sections. So now the advantage of a college Alpine Club is that they have to, because people graduate in 4 years, they have to train new leaders. In other words, they can't take the position, well, if you want to climb, you can stay with us and perhaps you'll become a climber. They have to pick the people that are interested and teach them how to climb so they have leaders 2 years later. So as a result, no matter how bad I was, there was an incentive for the people in this club to teach me how to climb. And we went to Yosemite. And Yosemite, people today say, what have you climbed in Yosemite? And I tell them, everything I have ever climbed in Yosemite is now called the approach. Because the standards have gone up so high since we were climbing there. But Yosemite had always maintained its relative reputation to the rest of climbing in the United States in terms of difficulty. So it really was a rock climbing, it really broke you in. If you climbed in Yosemite, you really had to practice, and it forced you to meet a minimum standard of technical ability. And because there weren't many holes, we always used pitons for protection, because we used to say a crux pitch in Yosemite at that time was either a friction pitch where you're just out on friction and no holes, or it was a jam crack, because there just weren't that many holes. There are holes, but I mean, it wasn't like the Tetons or other places where there are holes all over the place.
So, which other ranges you climbed?
What?
Which other ranges in after?
Well, I climbed in Yosemite. I climbed the Tetons, mostly. I spent one summer, 51, with a couple of friends. We climbed in the Tetons. Then we went to Canada. So we climbed in the Canadian Rockies. And we came back. And I also like to do sort of the classic climbs. We did the Stetner's Ledges on the east face alongs, which is the classic climb in Rocky Mountain National Park. And in Yosemite, we did the Lost Arrow, about the fourth ascent of the Arrow. And I climbed with a very fine climber. I was his 10-goal handicap. We made the second ascent at the east buttress of El Capitan. It's not one of those big walls, but it's off to the side. And to show you what the climbing standards, how it was changing so fast, when we did, it was one of the hardest climbs in the valley. 5 years later, when someone asked me what I'd done, the hardest thing I'd done, I mentioned, oh, that was a good climb in those days. 5 years later. I mean, I found that very amusing. So I did that. And another major thing that we did was we did Snowpatch. I did Snowpatch Spire at a time when that was a legendary spire. I had a very fine climbing companion. We made the fourth ascent of it. And the problem was it looked so ferocious. And we met someone who'd done it. We tried it once, turned back, went back in, and we were told, don't look more than 10 feet ahead of you. If you look too far, you'll give up. So we did exactly that, and we climbed it. We just didn't look too far where we were going and just kept following it, and we reached the top, and that was a big morale booster. So that's very brief. And then I started expeditions.
1 minute. I mean, now he has to change the battery. So just a minute more. Bas? Oh, yeah. Focus. Okay, so then how did your first expedition came around? Who were your companions during these years? Okay.
Our first
Who were your companions that time, and how did the first expedition come around?
We decided to go into the Coast Range of British Columbia, Mount Waddington. The Sierra Club party had been there. It was difficult of access. The mountain had only been climbed a few times, so the range was new. So it was a combination of expedition experience and bad weather, but you weren't really way off in Alaska or anywhere, but you were, and it was basically a group of us from the Stanford Alpine Club, and we got Andy Kaufman, who had been on Mount St. Elias from the east, as sort of an slightly older person to give some experience to the group. And we flew in, landed the airplane, bush pilot, at a place called Dumbbell Lake, as I say, named after the shape of the lake and not the mentality of people who land planes on it. And then we hiked up to the glacier, to our base camp high on the glacier, and then we waited for an airdrop. And the plane came in a day late, but I learned that an airdrop is a combination of Christmas and Easter. When you're there and you're running out of food, and all of a sudden the boxes of food come dropping out of the sky to you, it's Christmas. And then when you try to find them all over the glacier, it's Easter. I also learned don't drop anything you don't want to carry out, because we had extremely heavy loads at the end of the trip with all the stuff we had borrowed and dropped to ourselves. We had no choice but to carry these things out. And it was a great trip. We did quite a few climbs, but the weather was bad. We had a 7-day storm, straight storm, 10-day storm, and somehow that made us feel that, hey, if we can put up with this, we can put up with anything. Not correct, but it gave us the confidence to do other things. And so we picked up that experience.
Now all these times you were working
all this,
lawyer?
No, not yet. This was done, I did this through college, and I got my Air Force commission, but I'd broken my leg skiing 9 miles out. and I couldn't pass the physical for a year, so then I was deferred for law school. So basically, I was doing this as an undergraduate and as a law student in the summers. So this was when I was still a student. And in 1955, the day after the Coast Range trip, some people in Colorado organized a trip down to the Cordillera Blanca, Peru, and I was invited along with Dave Souls and the Stanford Club and Andy Kaufman. And we went down and climbed on North Pucahirca in the Cordillera Blanca. Beautiful, beautiful country. Good weather, very steep snow, but it's unusual. The snow conditions on the south side, which were bad, but the north side were very solid, just crampon up it. So that was in the big mountains without the weather. We got the weather in the Coast Range. And earlier, when we were in the storm in the Coast Range, you know how you do, you think about all the meals you're going to have when you get out and all the other ways to kill time lying in that tent. And so I got the impression, well, if we've done this, why can't we just go climb in the Himalaya, the Karakoram? And we somehow picked the Karakoram because we knew that Charlie, if the Italians didn't climb K2 in '54, we knew Charlie Houston would be going back. We felt sure that Charlie would be more than happy to help us go along, and he'd turn left at the Concordia for K2, and we'd just turn right and try something else. But why we thought that, don't ask me. But that was in our mind. But then the Italians climbed K2, so that part of the scheme fell apart. But then I got this idea, it was just stuck with me, that we really should go climb it. And from my point of view, I graduated from law school. I didn't want to take a job and quit it. I had 2 years of service in the Air Force to serve. So I figured when I get out of the Air Force, there's a gap. I can have a gap in there between leaving the Air Force and getting a job. And therefore that gap is the gap I was shooting for the Hidden Peak trip. And I picked Hidden Peak, and I picked the Karakoram for basically 2 reasons. One, I felt, looking at all I knew was reading the history and the documents, but I felt that the weather in the Karakoram was better than it was in the Himalaya. You had a better chance of climbing weather. 2, there were a whole bunch of 8,000 meter mountains. There was, Broad Peak and Gasherbrum 2 and Hidden Peak. So I felt that with luck, one of those might remain unclimbed until after I got out of the Air Force. So I won't bore you with all the details, but it took an awful lot. I mean, I spent years doing this, of putting this thing together, getting the permission, getting a party, and we went over and climbed the mountain. And we also, what we did, because, I felt, you're in our host country of Pakistan, and how would we feel if foreigners come in and climb all our mountains? So I said it was important that we have Pakistanis as full members of the party. And I didn't want just one Pakistani because everybody says he's a member of the party, but we have to have a liaison officer. So I said, I want 2 Pakistanis. Well, this was a radical break. This showed that we wanted more than just to call the liaison officer a member of the party. We meant it, and we did. And what it meant was very simple. He's one of us, which means he shares in it, but he also is carrying loads and everything else with us. So, and the result was that it really helped us all the way through Pakistan when people found out that we were a joint trip. And we had very good Pakistanis, and they're a very good thing. And we climbed Hidden Peak. We were very lucky. And another story about that was that I talked to Andre Rock, very famous Swiss climber, very nice man.
Where did you meet him?
I met him in Davos. He was doing his military service. And I tracked him down and I met him. He came down to see me. Very friendly, very nice man, just a sweet fellow. And he was very excited. And he said, the French went the wrong way. Because he had been there with Hans Ertl with during First International Expedition in '33, and they'd tried this other rib. And he said, we walked hands in pockets up this thing to above their Camp 3. And I said, oh. And the only problem was it was easier getting up, but then you had a long, long way in the snow to go up to the summit from there. But still, we were concerned about being trapped because, you knew the history, and we were afraid we didn't want to repeat Nanga Parbat 31, where you just get trapped out on a limb and you don't get off. But we decided on that route. And the thing, and I give Andre credit for this, I'm young and presumptuous. So he tells me how easy this is. So the thought that goes through my mind, and I couldn't figure out a diplomatic way to keep from blurting it out to this legendary climber, was, if it's so easy, why didn't you and Ertl push it? And he looks at me and he grins from ear to ear and says, oh, it was our first trip to the Himalaya and we didn't know what we were doing. Now right there, he put us on the route because he was straightforward, so that it wasn't anything hidden that was keeping us from doing this. So I've always remembered that. And so we went up. We always have to have. We had a good break in the weather, and we had Pete Schoening, who was our secret weapon. Extremely strong. He's the man who held 5 falling men on K2. We always used to say, Pete, if you can hold 5 men at 25,000 feet, how many can you hold at 15? And he and Andy reached the summit. We were successful, and we decided not to try to make a second party. We just got out of there. It was successful. We could see the weather changing. And
when did you reach personally?
I helped put in the high camp. I was in the support party with Tom Nevison and Bob Swift, and we put that high camp in, which was a heavy labor in that deep, deep snow at that altitude.
And how this climb was received back home?
Well, it was received well in climbing circles. And we had an article. I always ran one climbing article a year in the national magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, and we had an article in it. But in terms of the country, it didn't make a ripple.
I mean, you are not a national hero or anything.
Oh no. I mean, in fact, it was just the New York Times had the elevation wrong, the name's misspelled, and there a brief description of it. The only place where we got what did happen at the end of the trip, I sent a message off to my father that we'd climbed it and we were fine and all this. And 2 days later, I got a message saying, please call me, collect, or let us know how we can reach you. And this obviously didn't get my message. What had happened was, it'd gotten lost in transition. We got it later. But in my hometown paper in Dallas, in the front section of the paper, a little tiny thing at the bottom of some thing said, 2 Americans reached the summit of Hidden Peak on July 5, 1958, and Pete Schoening and Andrew Kaufman. So some friends of my family saw that. And they called up my parents and said, isn't that the trip Nick is on? So my parents saw this, and then they said, why hasn't he contacted us? I tell you this story because this shows you how much attention we got. That this is my hometown newspaper. And that was what was. But in the climbing circles, it was, of course, it was different. But in the general society, it made no difference whatsoever.
So after returning then, how did your life proceed?
Well, what happened was, we'd heard a lot about Masherbrum when we were up there, because one of our Pakistanis had been on Masherbrum in 1957 with the British. And it sounded fairly horrendous. And it's a tremendous looking mountain. And we could see this thing, just constantly reminded of it. So as we came out, I knew I could probably stall for a year or two getting an honest job. And we got the idea, and the British had almost climbed it. I mean, they had done very well, but the last little bit, they couldn't do it. So we would take advantage of this and just load it up, as I'd say, for bear to get that last part and finish the job. As it turned out, they gave us a road map, and unfortunately, we still had to drive it. So as we came down the Baltoro, I said, now's the time. Let's go back. We've done the high one. Let's do the hard one. So we came back, and I wrote the book, The Walk in the Sky, that summer, which gave me an excuse just between trips. And we got the permission, and then we went again.
How were you financing yourself in this period?
I was just living off my parents, to be blunt. I wasn't living high on the hog either, but I was surviving quite nicely,
Yes.
thank you. And when you're at that age, you don't run expenses up very high.
Yes.
But I knew that if you're going to do it, it had to be done then for
Yes.
two reasons. In my life, it could only be done then, and two, in terms of those mountains being climbed, this was the time. If you're going to do something, you can't postpone it. You had to go give it a try. So I worked on that. We worked together with George Bell, and we put together a wonderful party. We couldn't get Pete Schoening back, but we really got a very strong party. And of course, the Hidden Peak people could go if they wanted to, but they couldn't. They couldn't get free from stuff. So we had a strong party, and we went back. And that's what I'll be talking on. Is on Masherbrum, and that trip was, it was wonderful in the sense that everybody, Baltis, Pakistanis, Americans, everybody worked like a dog, and we were lucky, and we made it. And it was that combination of not just my effort or Bell's effort or Willie or Tom, everyone, including we had the best porters in Baltistan. We knew four of them from Hidden Peak. And our Sirdar, Ghulam Rasul, we had on Hidden Peak, marvelous man, honest. Boy, you couldn't ask for a better person. So, I have not been very tolerant of people who criticize, well, these people aren't very. And our pack officers were tremendous. Didn't have too much experience except one of them, but they carried their full share of this thing. So everybody working together. And as I learned more and looking back, we did a little bit of luck, known as weather and avalanches, and we made it. So then there's Masherbrum. At that point, I got a job as a lawyer down in Los Angeles. And I became active. I was active in the Sierra Club. It was a climbing group. It was a pioneer environmental group, Dave Brower. So I became very active in that on the side. So I was practicing law and active in the Sierra Club and climbing. So that, I'm still doing a few climbs, I could.
So then, after Masherbrum, was there any major expeditions you wanted to do?
Well, no. Well, except
you reached the summit of Masherbrum.
I reached the summit of Masherbrum with
So how was the view and
Captain Javed. With the two of us.
Two of you, okay.
The two of us reached the top at 6:50 at night, and it was very impressive. And the trouble is, as you know, especially at that hour, you wanted to stay there a long time and absorb it, but you couldn't do it. You just had to try to just get an impression of this thing. And it's sort of a strange feeling to be standing there and looking at K2 and Nanga Parbat off in the distance and Hidden Peak that we'd been on, and realize you are on top of this thing. And of course, the thing that goes through your mind, I had three thoughts. I'm always curious what it'd be like to stand on top of one of these things. One, the first thought was I really felt badly that other members of the party who had done more than I had, like Tom Hornblower and others, weren't up there too. I was glad to be up there, but I had wished my comrades had also been up there. So it was just the luck of the draw and how things happened to work. I happened to be there and they weren't. The other was get a shot of Javi with K2 in the background. Make sure you get a picture of Javi up here with K2 in the background, which I did. And the third thing, which the Tenzing told people he thought of on top of Everest, was now we got to get off this thing alive. In other words, don't blow it on the way down. And I won't go in details for this, but we almost did.
How did you? You fell? Avalanche?
No. The rappel rope jammed. And it's funny why you're sensitive to this, because it makes no difference why it's jammed, right? But it wasn't my rigging the rope, because it started to drop. You know how you pull a double line up? It was dropping to me when it jammed. And because we had no equipment, an avalanche had taken it out, we had to follow what Unseld and Bell had done, and they had rappelled down this avalanche gully. And since I didn't have a second rope, I couldn't do a full rappel. And there I am with Javi. There we are at 8 o'clock at night, dark, and our rope's jammed. So we tried to pull it. We weren't about to climb up it because you don't know what it's attached to. So we cut about 20 feet off, and I said we had one climbing rope and 20 feet of excellent sling. And basically, we built a bollard. We went down on a rappel, partway down, built a bollard out of deep snow, and it took forever, believe me, and wrapped this rope in, and then I could anchor and belay jobby down the next stretch down close to where they had a picket and a fixed rope in, and then I could pull it up and come down and join them. So it took just to be, it was a decision. We weren't going to bivouac, and I wasn't going to take the risk of climbing down that because it was snow, it was fluff over the ice. And it would just take one bad step and we were off, and there was this ice cliff down there. So I mean, it took a long time, but we were absolutely certain of what we were doing to get out of there. The result was we got back to Camp 7, where Dick Emerson was. He'd been sick, but he'd recovered at 7:30 in the morning, and we were out for 24 hours at this elevation. And at that point, I was pretty beat, and so was Javi. And we got down, and Hornby and Unsel came up to help us, and we all got off in one piece. So.
And what was the reaction back home for Masherbrum?
Again, it was well, in the climbing community, it was very well received. Yes. But in the outside world, we had an article in the Saturday Evening Post. But again, even less so than Hidden Peak, because Masherbrum was not an 8,000 meter mountain. So the result is, of all the trips I've ever done, that is today probably the least known. Not all of them, but the Antarctic trip, because we were sponsored by National Geographic, that got a huge amount of play in the Geographic. And not because of any virtue of me, but because they sponsored it. And it was successful.
So then, after coming back, you took over a job, married?
I got married. It was after Masherbrum, that's right, that I was with the law firm. And I went to Everest and came out. And this is a direct connection. President Kennedy had a bad back. And the man treating him was a Dr. Hans Kraus, an expert at physical therapy. And I got to be careful with my throat. And Dr. Kraus suggested to President Kennedy, when he was giving the Geographic Medal of the expedition, I should be there. So I wind up with an invitation there. So I'm there in Washington. And then I go over with Tom to a reception for the National Geographic for the expedition. And Betsy had been working that day as a researcher for the National Geographic with Tom Hornby on an article. So Tom introduces us. And our first date was the Everest expedition dinner at the American Alpine Club. And that was off we were. So we got married about a year later.
It happened.
That just happened. She moved out. And so we were married, and now it's 1966. And I just went to the Tetons for a week's vacation. A good friend, we climbed the North Ridge of the Grand Teton. We got back, and the day I got back, there was a telegram at my office from Bob Bates, my friend Bob. And what had happened was several groups of Americans had wanted to go down to climb the highest mountains in the Antarctic. And they were sort of rival groups, and they were using different ways of trying to get the government to support them, and it was counterproductive, and I tried to help put them together. And suddenly, the National Science Foundation, because of Phil Smith, decided that they wanted a national party that was capable down there now to climb these mountains and eliminate them as a desirable object for everybody in the world wanting to get down to make the first ascent of the Vinson Massif. So it goes from no, no, no to can you get a party in the field this coming season? So they had a three-man committee in the American Alpine Club to handle this. Bob Bates, Walter Wood, Brad Washburn. And what they did was they asked each group, could you work with the other? Then American Mountaineering was very small. We all knew each other. And they said yes. And they said, will Nick Clinch be okay as leader? And they said yes. So I get this telegram written in very impressive language to show to my partners to get leave, saying, are you available to lead expedition to climb the highest mountains in the Antarctic, declared to be in the national interest and sponsored by the Department of Defense, the National Science Foundation, and the National Geographic Society. So what else are they going to say? I mean, you mean to say those guys want that character we hired? Well, sure, he can, off he goes. Yeah. So I won't go into all the details now, but so that was the story behind that trip. And my hunch was correct, was normally I wouldn't have done this, but I knew the people involved, and I knew that once we got going, everybody would get along and work together. And that is exactly what happened. So we had a great trip. We climbed 6 mountains. They're all first ascents, the 4 highest peaks in the Antarctic and 2 others. The best ascent was Tyree, the second highest by Corbett and Evans. It was a tremendous effort. That was the real mountaineering accomplishment. And we came back because of the National Geographic sponsorship of this to publicity like I'd never seen or hope to see again. And we survived that. But I mean, suddenly you go from no one's heard of you to your pictures spread across 2 pages of the National Geographic, which fortunately I'm wearing a balaclava helmet, so you can't tell who I am. So I could survive that. So that was the Antarctic trip. And people, because of Antarctica, thought that must have been a really horrendous trip. Actually, it was cold. But compared to climbing on the expeditions in the Himalaya, the risk and the difficulty and so forth, it was nothing. And you try to tell them this, oh, it wasn't very bad. Oh, you're so modest. I just gave up. I mean, we can't get across. We're riding around out there in a snowmobile, pulling sleds full of food from New Zealand, and just having the time of our life. None of this hard rations for 2 months, So that was the Antarctic expedition.
And now Betsy was taking it well, that you descended for a long time?
Well, she was taking that well, although she discovered she was pregnant after I left on that trip. So we had our first daughter that fall. And
well, what is she doing now, daughter?
Well, we're not in touch with that daughter, but she's married and in Los Angeles. Okay. And the younger one is, we have 2 daughters, and the younger one is living in San Francisco as a graphic artist, and we see her quite a bit. Okay. So, and I can't go into all the back and forth of my career. I mean, I went back east for a couple of years.
If it is more, we'll do it in Missouri also.
Okay. Anyway, but it was
comfortable today.
The only thing that I left out was when I went in the Air Force, I was immediately sent to Iceland. Now no one wanted to go there, but I had the gall after having gone to law school to say I wanted to be a survival instructor. Well, they didn't let me, of course, but they made a note, this guy we can probably ship to Iceland and we'll have a good time. And that was absolutely true. I had a wonderful time. I got to go across the Vatnajökull with an Icelandic bunch of people because I got to know the Icelanders, and I showed them my Yosemite pictures, so they promptly let me in. And I made a first ascent of a very spectacular lava spire on the north coast with 2 Icelanders. And I didn't realize what we had done until afterwards. It turned out this is one of the most famous pinnacles on the island, and their most famous poet, don't ask me how, lived in a farm underneath this pinnacle and wrote his most famous love poem about this pinnacle. And somehow, suddenly, here is the picture of, this is a time when American-Icelandic relations were a bit strange, and here's this picture of this American and 2 Icelanders arms around each other who have climbed this mountain. As a result, the Air Force just said, you can go anywhere you want, as long as it doesn't interfere with your law stuff. You can go off this base, take your duty pass, just you go. So, I mean, I had a great time up in Iceland because of my climbing. I mean, if it weren't for my climbing and that, I'd have been stuck on the base like all the others. But because of the climbing and the relationship I developed with the Icelanders, the general was very happy. And I'm glad he was, because he saw me out of uniform up the north coast the day after we climbed this mountain. He was looking at me, and I thought, whoops, But it worked out well. So I just throw that story in.
So after this, another Himalayan expedition?
Well, we went back to Paiute in '74, and we helped open the Karakoram of that. And we had a fatal accident to one of the Pakistanis, unfortunately. And then we crossed over the Masherbrum Law on the way out to the Hushi Valley. And that was a difficult trip for obvious reasons, more than just the. And after that,
Who were with you on this trip?
It was basically a family trip. It was Dick Emerson and his wife Pat, Tom Hornbein and Kathy and their children, and we had 3 Pakistanis with us. So it was just it was a tough trip. So after that, the next thing was Eric Shipton stayed at our house a couple of times. Very nice man, and I asked Eric if he'd go anywhere in the world, where would he go? And he mentioned 2 places. One of them was a mountain called Ulag Mustag in the Kunlun Range, which is totally, what is it type of thing. And it was sort of exciting because in the 80s to think there was something in which you didn't have any information on that's supposedly over 25,000 feet high. As it turned out, it wasn't. It was less than 23, but still. So at that point, naturally, I just felt I know it's impossible. The Chinese won't let us in or anything, but we just got to try to get in there and see what this is like, because it's amazing you can have something like this in this day and age. And eventually, working with Bob Bates, we did put together permission for a joint Chinese-American trip. Went in, and 5 Chinese reached the summit of the mountain. So that was fascinating to be able to go into that region, although it wasn't very dramatic because we ended up driving in great big French army trucks that drove 280 miles off-road through the high plateau to get to this.
How was the climb?
The climb wasn't that too difficult. It wasn't too technical. You had to be careful. It was ice, but it was fairly straightforward. And but there was an accident. The Chinese couple in the dark coming down, they slipped, and so we helped rescue them. Some of the Americans and Chinese. We went down and helped save the Chinese leader. Very nice guy. And so, but it worked out. He fully recovered, I'm happy to say. And it was a successful trip. And of course, the Chinese made a huge fuss over this thing, our surprise, because you see, this is the 40th anniversary of their taking over Xinjiang. And they had parades and everything. And this expedition, it's sort of unnerving to have, you see, you listed having made the first ascent of this mountain, and you haven't even gotten there yet. So the heat was sort of on to get up this thing, and which we did. But so they made a big fuss over it. And there was one humorous story. They just built this big glass marble Palace of the People. And so we had a big state dinner in there. The governor, the head of the military, the whole thing was in there. And here we all were in these clothes they had made for us. And we had this for an hour. We had this marvelous entertainment, these Uyghur dancers and so forth. And suddenly, it goes dead silent. And I'm at the head table. I'm seeing the Chinese governor to my right, and Bob Bates is on his other side. And so I turned to our interpreter, who by now we were very good friends. And I said, "Guo, what's happening?" And he gives me this sort of evil look. And he smiles and says, "It's the Americans' turn to entertain."
Oh.
So here we are, big thing. What are we going to do? So I thought, I knew Bob, he knew all these vaudeville songs. So I went around the governor and said, "Hey, Bob, you and I have got to get up there and entertain these people. We got to sing." "What do we do? We sing. What do we sing?" "We'll sing The Wreck of the Old 97. This is this rousing song about a train wreck." So we get up there, and we're asked, my interpreter asked me, "What's it about?" So we're going to sing The Wreck of the Old 97. They thought we were going to sing America the Beautiful or something like that. And he said, "What's it about?" And I said, "A train wreck." And he said, sort of a horrible look came over his face. And then I realized the Chinese at that time are very good at expressing opinions of things indirectly. So I think he thought I was expressing my opinion of the expedition with a song about a train wreck. But at any rate, Bob and I went at it full bore, and we made such utter fools of ourselves. They loved it. I mean, we were utter idiots. And so we got off. So I say that he and I are the only ones I know who sang The Wreck of the Old 97, the great hall of the people in Urumqi.
So all this time you were, again, still climbing in the States?
Yeah.
Your job was going on?
I was at this point, let's see, 86. What had happened was I'd come back, I'd been vice president council of a savings and loan, went to Paiute. Later, I've been very active in the environmental movement, the Sierra Club. And I was on the board of the Sierra Club Foundation, not the club, but the foundation. I was active in all the inside committees of the club. And so the executive director of the Sierra Club Foundation, the first one, decided to leave, and I decided I wanted to move back to the Bay Area. So I said, "Look, I'll do it for 5 years." So I then became the executive director of the Sierra Club Foundation. When that ended, 5 years, that was enough. I was an environmental consultant for a while on a project for a company I used to represent as a lawyer. And when that ended, my sister's husband prematurely died, cancer, and left her with some radio stations. So suddenly now I am involved in holding that all together. So flying back to Denver, not running it, but looking it over. And my parents are getting older, so I started to take over the family stuff at that thing. And then right in the middle of that, so I went off to Willag Mustag. So it's, you know, the situation I have, I can control my schedule up to a point, but there's a lot of things I have to do. But I can still, I'm not tied to an absolute schedule.
But now no more high altitude climbing after that, 86.
Well, not really. We went into Yunnan in 88, 89, 92, and 93 because the Chinese felt they owed us one, and they invited us at their expense to come in and try this mountain in Yunnan, which is a fascinating experience.
What about your trekking and exploration in the Salvin and those sites?
Well, see, that's part of this. That was part of these trips. And on the last trip, I decided I wasn't as strong as some of the other guys, but I got the permission. I wanted to do the pilgrims. I mean, we'd already dropped down to the Salween from our high camp up on the Shula, and the year before. But I wanted to do that. I was curious, just, you know, curiosity. What was it like to do this pilgrimage the Tibetans did around this mountain? So I got permission for that, and I went to our mountain that we're trying, Peak 6509, by way of down to the Salween around and back up over the Shula, and went over the Dokkerla, the southern pass, and it was fascinating to do that and see the back of what it's like. You know, you're always curious till you see it, and so I did that, and a couple of years later, Tom Nakamura did it. But I think I was probably the first one to do that, since maybe the missionaries or the people in the 23s, and Alexander David Neal, as far as I can turn. Other people had gone down and stuff to make that complete circuit.
So you have not written about this? There is no chance of you writing a biography?
No. What I did was, we didn't publicize these Yunnan trips too much. Ad Carter, my friend Ad Carter, editor of the American Alpine Journal, wanted something on the record. So we put some very vague things in the American Alpine Journal, but we did not go into any detail nor tell anybody. I do it morally. What an incredible sight this was that Nakamura made known. To go up to the top of the Dokkerla or the Shula and look to the
But why
west.
were you reticent about it?
What? Because, first of all, two reasons. One, at that time the place was closed to foreigners. Only the Japanese got in, and ourselves. I mean, you couldn't get in. Two, to be blunt, we had this magic playground sitting there, and we weren't prepared to tell the world about it until at least we had our fun there. And then what happened, as happened in all of China, it went from being absolutely impossible to get into to being wide open, except that they did prohibit climbing of this mountain range after we were there, because the Japanese had an accident on Karkapo, which is the mountain we'd been trying to. And 17 people died in this avalanche. I went to Kyoto to pay my respects to the families, but they that had the Tibetans sufficiently. They weren't happy with this whole thing anyway, and so the climbing there in this range is out, but it's now a tourist attraction, and it was fascinating to be in that country before the change, to get a feel for the culture and. It was a true Tibetan culture.
So any more other, that was one of some of your last...
That was, but yeah, in 81 I led a trek into the east face of Everest as part of that east face expedition. I was the trek leader, and that was a fascinating experience because you'd see these cairns, and you knew they'd been built by the British in 1921. Because very few people, one Swiss guy had been sneaking in, I'm sure, had been up the Kama Valley until the 81 American Everest trip. And I had the trek coming in. So I told them that this was not an ordinary trek, this was a minor expedition. And it was. It went very well, and I'm very proud of the fact that every member of that party reached base camp, including a couple of people I don't think even started hiking until we started in. It was like that. So that covers it.
All your visits to Himalayan
And
mountains.
it covers the visits.
Yeah.
I did one other thing in '57 in the Andes. I was in the Air Force. The second year I was in Long Beach, California, so I took a 30-day leave. I knew the Cordillera Blanca. You know how it is when you know the territory. You can then go quickly and lightly. So we did. We went down and made the first ascent of a mountain called Nevado San Juan, about 19,000 feet in the Cordillera. So that pretty much covers.